Good morning to everybody. Appreciate you coming on early. We will attempt to get going at 10 o'clock sharp. So appreciate your patience. For those attending, this will be recorded. So we will share with our SAPA partners who are co-sponsoring this event, and that will be available for distribution. Good morning to those coming in. We will get going right around 10 o'clock sharp. So I appreciate your patience and thank you. And I do see a lot of familiar faces on our attendee list, which is always great. Good morning, attendees. Again, don't mean to belabor this, but we'll get going roughly around 10 o'clock and appreciate your patience. Hopefully everybody out there is hearing this okay. If you, I believe we did some test runs and I think we should be good, but any problems, you can obviously use the Q&A to just for formalities, we are doing this. I had a text. We are doing this in webinar mode. So those attendees will not be able to unmute. We'll use the question and answer tool to make sure any questions. Good morning, group. We are a few minutes away from kicking off our event today. Our attendee list is growing fast. We had a pre-registration of roughly 260 attendees, which is incredible. So looking forward to hopefully having you all get some really meaningful content out of this event. Good morning, group. A minute or two away from getting started here. Jonathan, I see your hand up. If you can type your question in the Q&A, we'll make sure we get a response for you. Hey, group. We are at 10:01, so let's be cognizant of everybody's time. Let's get rolling here. I do see attendees are still populating, but we'll get started. So welcome to our virtual training session on the Emerald Eco Label, an environmental product declaration tool. This session is designed to guide you through the process of understanding and utilizing the Eco Label and EPDs for asphalt mixtures. During this program, we will cover the following key aspects of the Emerald Eco Label: introduction to EPDs, Emerald Eco Label and the overview of that, policies that the different agencies in the region are starting to implement, and to discuss the collection of data and what that data means, using the tool. And we're going to bring on an expert panel who have used the tool, have gotten started, have found the challenges that then they're going to share those experiences with the group. And then we're going to talk about the Q&A session after the panelists get done. And the real goal of this event is to navigate and look at the EPD software, help our industry members navigate that, understand the challenges, be able to hear from those who have used it. We also invited our agency partners, as we want them to hear the challenges. We also want them to understand how the system works, what the outputs will mean. And so that's why we're trying to be totally transparent this process and make sure we're all together in our efforts. I just want to offer, as we go through this process, I wanted to share this. So this is kind of a slide I'd use now in every event I go to, because sustainability is in front of everybody. I call it Groundhog Day all over again, because there's no event we go to where the name EPD doesn't get stated many, many times. It doesn't matter if we're in a technical talk or they're discussing policy, the sustainability component is everywhere. And I think we're very fortunate in how the asphalt industry has approached this. You know, between our warm mix products, our recycling efforts, we've been really on the front line of this for quite a long time. I'm going to just give you the outline of our program today. We're going to just do this, finish up with this brief introduction. We're going to bring up on Joseph Chicat, who's really our industry's true expert. We've been working through this process for the last 10 years, and Joseph's been our lead person through NAPA, the National Asphalt Pavement Association. After that, we're going to get to our expert panel. We'll have Charlie Goodhart and Mary Robbins lead that from Pennsylvania Asphalt Pavement Association. And then we'll have 3 panelists who will discuss how they've worked through the software and the challenges they've seen. We'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll have a quick wrap up. So that's our goal for today. Without further ado, I'm going to bring up our primary presenter today. Again, that's Joseph Chicat. He is Director of Sustainable Pavements at NAPA. Joseph is really leading our industry in the development of the Eco Label and our EPD software. He is the face of our industry in these efforts, and you can't go anywhere without seeing Joseph on an agenda to present on these topics. Again, I discussed the warm mix efforts, the recycling efforts that are going on already in our industry, have been going on for many, many years. So with that, before I do bring you up, Joseph, I'm going to thank our SAPA partners. Those are the state asphalt associations who are really on the front line with our agencies and our state partners. West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, and Massachusetts, along with those in the Northeast who aren't present on this event. But they are really your first line of defense. Speak with them, make sure they are, make the calls to them, discuss what you're thinking, and then we can have all of us in the same playing field to make sure this goes ahead in a really sustainable and progressive way. So with that, I'm going to unshare and bring Joseph up.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to bring up my slide deck here, and as I do so, I want to apologize to the New Jersey and Massachusetts folks for somehow forgetting your logos on my cover slide. I swear it's nothing against you folks. I've had lots of great personal memories and experiences in both of those states. Can someone confirm that I'm sharing the right thing here? Bruce?
Yeah, you are, Joseph. All looks good. It's your main slide deck.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off with, I've been here at NAPA about 5 years, a little over 5 years. I've been involved with the industry now, 10 years prior to NAPA, working for a mixed producer, the largest mixed producer in the state of Hawaii, actually, for, about 10 years. So I've been in this industry for a little over 15 years. And this EPD program is really the bulk of what I do at NAPA. And you'll see as I go through this presentation that there's a lot involved, but I also don't want you to be afraid of it, especially if you're a mixed producer. I want you to look at this as an opportunity to learn more about your operations and to become more efficient and to reduce your emissions and do that in a cost-effective way. So I'm going to start, though, with a story, because I like stories. I think stories are helpful in kind of bringing things full, to something that's relatable. And that is something that I bought a few weeks ago, which was a new pair of shoes. I went to Dick's Sporting Goods, spent about an hour trying on half a dozen or so different pairs of shoes for running shoes. And I found this pair. By the time I finished trying on all these shoes, it didn't matter to me what the price was, because they were the ones that fit my foot just the way I wanted it to, right? Now, what's interesting is after I picked these shoes, I noticed this thing in the sole of one of the shoes. It's carbon footprint, 10.7 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Here's a pair of shoes where they're putting the carbon footprint right on the shoe. That's really interesting. And it got me thinking, because I know that there's various surveys out there, and one of them that I found shows that more than 2/3 of consumers are willing to pay a premium for sustainable products. Now, they broke this down actually by demographics, by political party, by gender, by a few different things. And in every demographic breakdown, it was a majority, more than 50%, were willing to pay a premium for sustainable products. So I thought to myself, would I be willing to pay more for shoes with a lower carbon footprint? Well, maybe if they both if they both fit my foot right and all that sort of thing, right? So that's really important. Does it fulfill the function that I need it to fulfill? But I also thought, if they did, could I actually compare this pair of shoes carbon footprint to some other pair of shoes, maybe say a pair of Nikes or a pair of New Balance or something like that? And so I went and did a little research, and I went to the ASICS website and I looked up their methodology. And thankfully, they post their methodology on the website. That was really helpful. But it is ASICS methodology. It's not the National Association of athletic shoes. I don't know if that exists or not, but it was just their own company methodology. So that made me realize and understand that I really can't use this for any sort of decision-making purposes, because somebody else, if they have their carbon footprint, might be using a different methodology, and that would be like comparing apples to oranges, right? So that's problematic. So that was kind of a learning lesson, got me to kind of think about where the shoe industry is with respect to disclosing carbon footprints and that sort of thing. But it's really interesting. Now, notice the version number. This is very recent, right? Version 1.1 just published a couple weeks ago. So pretty interesting. So let's talk about the main topic here, which is this whole kind of set of items, I guess, LCAs, EPDs, and PCRs. I want to make sure that everyone understands what they are. We're just going to start with the alphabet soup. I'm going to start with an LCA. LCA is a life cycle assessment where you're looking at the inputs, outputs, and potential environmental impacts of a product system throughout its life cycle, right? So that's the life cycle part. And the assessment is looking at all those inputs, outputs, and impacts. Now, when you do an LCA, the first thing you're going to do is identify the goal. What kind of question do you want to answer by conducting this LCA? And that will help you understand what the scope of your LCA needs to be. Which life cycle stages do I really need to look at to answer this question? Which things can I ignore because maybe they're not important to answer this question? As you develop that goal and scope, you are then going to do your inventory analysis, which are what are all of your inputs, things like how much energy goes into making a product, what are the raw ingredients, how much electricity, fuel, that sort of thing. And what are your outputs? Those are going to be things like your products and your co-products and that sort of thing. And also, what are all the emissions? And it could be thousands of compounds that are emitted through the overall manufacturing process or use and that sort of thing. So the next stage is the impact assessment, which is the data reduction. So your emissions might include things like CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide. All these are greenhouse gases. So you reduce that down into a single parameter called global warming potential. And that's a lot easier to manage, right? And for some of the impact indicators, there could be literally thousands of chemical compounds that feed into a single impact indicator. So that data reduction part is really important. And then this big box on interpretation is really important because you might start with a certain goal and scope. And then as you're doing your inventory analysis, realize that there are data gaps that prevent you from actually being able to answer the question you originally wanted to answer. And you might have to go back and refine your goal and scope accordingly. So that's, and you can do that iteratively throughout the entire process. There's all sorts of questions you can answer with an LCA. I don't want to get into those in a lot of detail, but the type of question you're going to answer is going to dictate your goal and scope. So what is an EPD? So the EPD is the Environmental Product Declaration. The best way to think of this is a standardized LCA report, where it's designed to enable comparisons between products that fulfill the same function. Now, remember my analogy there with the shoes? So that was not an EPD because I really can't compare that pair of shoes carbon footprint to some other pair of shoes carbon footprint because it's not standardized unless I'm looking at one pair of ASICs to another, for example. So that's one of the differences there. EPDs also report a number of impact categories, not just your carbon footprint. So we'll get into that later on in this presentation. And EPDs are also independently verified. I didn't see anything in the ASICs methodology that showed that their calculations have any sort of verification. So that's an example of kind of the differences that are out there. One key things about comparing EPDs is you should not be comparing EPDs across different product categories for a lot of reasons. But as you learn, as we kind of go into this a little bit more, I think you'll understand why that's important. So what is the PCR? The PCR is a set of product category rules. This essentially sets the standards, the rules, requirements, guidelines for developing EPDs for one or more product categories. So in our industry, we have two really key PCRs at this point in time. One is the core PCR for construction products and services. That covers all construction products and services. It's ISO 21930. It's an international standard, and it's a very kind of broad-based kind of standard. And then we have a number of subcategory PCRs. This one here is the one we have for asphalt mixtures. PCR for asphalt mixtures in North America. So that's actually a subcategory under ISO 21930. So it's complies with all the requirements of 21930 and then adds additional requirements if you're developing an EPD for asphalt mixtures in the US. There are PCRs for things like aggregates, ready mix concrete, Portland cement, a number of PCRs under development in our space for asphalt binder, one for additives coming online as soon as well. So emulsions, there's a number of PCRs that are coming online over the next probably 1 year, maybe 2 years. PCRs are managed by a program operator. That program operator is responsible for revising it and keeping it up to date and publishing the EPDs that are developed under that PCR. And they're developed by a committee. So it's not just an individual, but it's a committee, broad-based, typically involves customers, agencies, the supply chain, up and down the supply chain, and then manufacturers as well. PCRs are reviewed by an independent panel of experts. So at least 3 individuals are reviewing this PCR. And it also goes out to public review and comments. So there's a lot of kind of oversight processes embedded in the overall program. Now, let's look at the life cycle assessment kind of aspect of things. These are all the life cycle stages of an asphalt pavement, starting with raw materials, extraction and processing. This could be things like mining aggregates and crushing them, screening them, pulling petroleum out of the ground, refinery operations, asphalt binder terminal operations, all that sort of thing. That's all materials. Getting those materials to your plant, that's the A2 stage, and then plant operations is the A3 stage. These are the 3 stages that are included in an EPD with our Emerald Ecolabel software, because these are the 3 stages that mixed producers really have control over, right? Once it leaves the mixed producer's plant, it could be sold FOB to a customer who's going to do their own paving operations. The producer often doesn't have control over what kind of road it's going to be on, how that pavement's designed, what the maintenance schedule is going to look like over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. What's going to happen at the end of life. Those are often in the hands of the pavement owner or some other contractor or that sort of thing. If you want to look at those additional life cycle stages, you can conduct a life cycle assessment. You can use your EPD as a data source for that LCA, right? So it's modular kind of program, a modular system. So if you're an agency and you want to look at kind of the full life cycle, by collecting EPDs, you're getting really good data for those first 3 life cycle stages from your contractors, from your suppliers, and that sort of thing. And then LCA Pave is a free software tool, Excel-based tool developed by Federal Highways Administration that will do all these life cycle stages except for the use phase. So the vehicle fuel consumption and that sort of thing is not included in LCA Pave. So that's the full life cycle kind of view of an LCA and an EPD. So we have in our EPD program, we have a handful of really important components. One is our general program instructions. These are essentially the administrative rules for the program. We have an underlying life cycle assessment. So the PCR is telling you how to do an LCA to develop an EPD. if you're going to write rules about how to do an LCA, you have to know what's important. What are the key parameters that matter? What are the things you can ignore? What are the upstream data sets you should be using? That sort of thing. So that's all pulled from the underlying life cycle assessment. It's a really important document, which informs development of the PCR. And then once that PCR is finalized, we have a software program that lets mix producers pretty easily develop EPDs for asphalt mixtures that complies with the PCR for asphalt mixtures and all the other standards that PCR is compliant to as well. So that's the overall program in a nutshell. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happening in the policy space, because this is going to inform kind of, why this is really becoming important today. I'm going to start with in this section, the results from a study that Oregon Department of Transportation commissioned a few years ago. They did their the ODOT's emissions inventory over a 4-year average, 2016 to 2019. And they were looking at what are the agency's scope 1 emissions in green, so the direct emissions coming out of the agency's equipment, buildings like the furnace systems in buildings and that sort of thing. What are the scope 2 emissions? So the upstream electricity production for any electricity that the agency is using, and then the scope 3 are the direct or indirect emissions associated with contracted services and that sort of thing. Now, what's interesting about this is for this particular agency, it's the only one I know who's done this and published it. The largest single contributor to that agency's carbon footprint was asphalt mix production. Now, if you're in the asphalt industry, you might be saying, well, boy, I know that asphalt has a much lower carbon footprint than concrete does, for example, Portland cement concrete. So how is asphalt the biggest contributor? I'll tell you, a lot of this is because of the volume. This agency over those 4 years averaged about 1 million tons of asphalt use per year versus about 100,000 tons of concrete use per year. So that kind of shows you, the volume really matters. And in most agencies, most of their pavement network is asphalt. You're going to find a very similar result if you do this sort of analysis. So from an agency perspective, a pavement owner's perspective, if you are in a state where you're being asked, or by whether it's the governor, by the legislature, public pressure, whatever it might be, if you're being asked to reduce your state's carbon emissions, as a Department of Transportation, one of the biggest things that you can do is try to reduce your embodied carbon through all the construction materials that you procure. So several states have established these what I'll call buy clean policies. They're on here in green. California was really the first, although theirs does not still yet apply to asphalt and concrete yet. They do have some pilot programs, but then Colorado came on board a few years ago, followed by Oregon and Minnesota at the legislative level. And then just this year, New York and Delaware have kind of joined in on this, but not from a legislative initiative, more from a policy and executive order perspective. So we're starting to see some new policies. Now, all these things, all these programs at the state level, generally focus on, one, the contractor submitting EPDs to an agency, and there are thresholds typically for what size project is relevant and that sort of thing. And then the agency developing some sort of policy around what they're going to do with this information. Some of them in Colorado, for example, are very strict go, no go. You have to be, we're going to establish a limit for this type of product. You have to be below that limit in order to qualify to provide services to the state agency, right? I think that's personally the worst approach you could take for a whole bunch of reasons, which we don't need to get into today. Please hit me up afterwards. I'd be happy to talk your ear off about why that's a really kind of bad policy decision. But we're also seeing incentives and disincentives. And we're also seeing agencies that really just want to collect the data to do the sort of analysis, for example, that Oregon DOT did a couple of years ago, right? Just to understand where they are. So that's what those state policy initiatives look like. There's also a number of states involved with various initiatives and programs that are either pushing the states to develop an EPD policy or educating the state about what EPDs and LCA are. So you have the state Buy Clean programs on here. You have a federal state Buy Clean partnership, which is, between a task force established at the Office of the White House and a whole bunch of states. You have the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is some additional states that are involved with this federal state Buy Clean partnership. You have the Everyday Counts EDC 7 initiative for EPDs for sustainable project delivery. And you have the Federal Highways Administration's Climate Challenge Grant Program. So all these are in place. If you sum them all up, there's 39 different states involved with at least one of these. And many states are involved with more than one. So there's a lot of kind of pressure. There's a lot of information exchange happening, a lot of education, and some policy development around these programs. So it's really informative to be kind of aware of what's going on in this space. I'm not going to go into the details of each of these just for the sake of time, but I'd encourage you to Google any one of these to learn more about what's involved. Now, the big kind of driver on the policy perspective was the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed a little more than a year ago. It was August of 22, I guess. And in there's a couple of really big grant programs, $2 billion to federal highways to procure low carbon construction materials, right? So this is a grant program that's going to go from Federal Highways Administration to state, local, and federal agencies for federal aid highway roads. This grant program has not been announced yet. They're probably going to announce it in January. But this will be funding to these agencies that will allow them to pay a premium for low carbon materials. That premium could be in the form of the differential cost. So if a low carbon material is more expensive than a conventional material, then they'll be able to pay for that additional cost. Or it could be in terms of an incentive. Sometimes your low carbon materials are actually less expensive than a conventional material, but in this way you could pay a bonus, for example, to procure that low carbon material. So that's what that $2 billion is going to go to. Then the GSA, the General Services Administration, has another $2.15 billion for federal building projects, really similar program. And FEMA also has the ability, when you're doing a FEMA project under a grant from FEMA, that the agency, when they're applying for that grant from FEMA, can say, we want to use low carbon materials. And they'll say, okay, you can, and you can pay for the differential cost or incentive for those low carbon materials. But if you say you're going to do that in your grant application to FEMA, they're going to hold you to it. You have to actually do that. So there's over $4 billion being pushed into procurement of low carbon materials. Now, the natural question to ask here is, what is a low carbon material? What's a low carbon asphalt mix, right? That's a really important question. How are you going to spend these $4 billion? So last winter, the EPA came out with this interim determination of what defines a substantially lower embodied carbon product. And they said, all right, you're going to look at industry averages. You're going to find the best performing 20th percentile of a similar material or product. And that might not be available at your project area. So if it's not, then you can go down to the best performing 40th percentile. And if that's not available locally, then you can go to the better than estimated, the estimated industry average. So it's sort of a cascading set of thresholds. Now, EPA didn't define what those numbers actually are for each product. They left it up to the GSA and the Federal Highways Administration to define those thresholds. And they basically said, here's the criteria, here's the ways we want you to look at this. Now you agencies go out and define these for your own projects. So the GSA was really quick off the bat, and about a month ago, they announced 150 projects to spend pretty much all that $2 billion across the country. Lots of projects here in the Mid-Atlantic region, looking at West Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, DC. Sorry, Delaware, no GSA projects in Delaware in this round, but you'll see that this is a pretty kind of broad nationwide initiative. Now, the way the GSA is structured, they're not a low bid customer, they're a best value bid customer. And so when the general contractor submits their bid, they will submit, we have identified and found low carbon materials that meet the GSA's thresholds, which we'll get to in a second. And they get more points towards their bid for every low carbon material that they have identified, right? So what the GSA did, they've done this for a bunch of different products, but for asphalt, they basically took all the published EPDs at the time that they were looking at their analysis, and they came up with what's the 20th percentile, the 40th percentile, and the better than average limit for asphalt mixtures. This is a nationwide number, right? It does not take into account things like whether your mix is polymer modified or not, whether your agency requires hydrated lime or not, how much RAP does your agency allow, what kind of climate region do you live in, and how does that affect the amount of moisture, for example, in your aggregates, and that how does that affect mix production and that sort of thing. This is what I would say maybe a good try at a first attempt, a $2 billion attempt, I should say, to establishing industry averages, but probably not the best approach for our industry, because there's a lot of things that agencies require in their specifications that are really outside the control of the mix producer. And those agency specifications have a very significant impact in the results of some of these of EPDs. So we've been talking with the GSA. We have an ongoing dialogue with them. They're open to listening to us. They're open to looking at new approaches as soon as we have a new one fully fleshed out. But for now, this is where they're at. So what is that other approach that we could be doing? So we spent back in February of this year a day and a half in a workshop at our office here in Greenbelt, Maryland, where we brought in folks from the Federal Highways Administration, from the FAA, and from the EPA to go through like how do we come up with industry averages for our industry, because it's pretty complicated with all the kind of vast number of agency specifications and kind of regional production trends and that sort of thing. And so we came up with an approach. It's driven by industry data, right? That's really, really key. It's industry averages. So industry data is the key kind of input, but accounts for local agency specifications. So you can look at things like, are we requiring a modified binder, maybe for like an SMA mix or something like that? Are we, how much RAP do we allow in the mix, or is maybe conventionally used in that mix? Other things that are kind of embedded in agency specifications, we can make adjustments to the industry averages to account for those things. And we're also dividing those industry averages into geographic regions so that we can look at climate impacts on mixed production, as well as material transportation distances. And in some markets, transporting rock to your plant can be a very, very significant aspect. If you're, driving your rock in more than say 30 or 40 miles, that could be really significant. In some places geographically across the country, people are shipping their rock in 2,000 miles. I'll tell you, that has a really, really big impact on EPD results. So we started a data gathering, benchmarking, data collection initiative back in the May-June timeframe. We reopened that about a month ago, and we have benchmarking data collection open through January 8th. This shows, sorry, I have Minnesota data in here. Don't worry about that. But this shows there will be no cost for mixed producers to participate in this benchmarking initiative. So the only barrier really is time, right? You don't have to be a NAPA member. You don't have to pay a dime to participate in benchmarking. All you have to do is pull your data together and submit it to us, right? And this is what FHWA is committed to using for its $2 billion grant program to identify what those low carbon materials will be. You see in the states in green here have submitted data from at least 3 independent companies, which is what we need as a minimum to potentially publish state level data. The states in orange have less than 3 companies submitted. So New Jersey and Delaware, we really need your participation if you haven't already done so. And then gray shows nobody has participated. So West Virginia, we really need your participation if you're on this call. Like I said, it's no cost to participate. Go to this website, asphaltpavement.org/EPD, to learn how to participate. We have a fact sheet. It's fairly straightforward, and we'll walk through some of that data later on here in this presentation. Just doing a time check. I think I'm good. So overall, what we're seeing is a real paradigm shift in procurement for asphalt mixes. We have worked under the low bid environment for, our whole careers, right? But we're seeing pilot programs, we're seeing some programs where they're just asking you to submit an EPD information only. We're seeing programs where the agency is willing to pay a premium through either a differential cost or an incentive for low carbon materials. And we're seeing hard and fast pre-qualification global warming potential or GWP limits. Again, I think that's the worst approach to go at this point in time, but we are seeing that in some of these policies. So let's take a look. One quick look here at where the industry is with respect to EPDs. As of a few weeks ago, we had almost 250 plants across the country with published EPDs, more than 1,700 mixes across 41 states. So we're getting pretty broad participation kind of across the country. But really, we have an estimated probably 3,500 asphalt plants across the country. So we're, less than 10% with published EPDs. So very much still in the early adopter phase, but seeing kind of a steady increase in the number of companies, number of plants participating over, every week we have more and more folks coming on board. So how do you get started with EPDs? So I'm going to go through for the next maybe 20 minutes or so, 15 or 20 minutes, kind of an overview of what's involved with developing EPDs. So overall, we have the EPD software, Emerald Ecolabel, right? So if you're new to this, first thing you're going to do is go to asphaltepd.org. That's the Emerald Ecolabel website. You're going to create a profile. Then you're going to watch 2 training webinars, or maybe more than that, but we'll get to that in a second. Pass the quizzes. You're going to compile your data. We have a Excel-based data gathering sheet that helps you compile all your data for your plants and for your mixes. If you want to develop EPDs, you're going to purchase access for your plants. But if you don't want to, and you just want to do benchmarking, you can do benchmarking without purchasing access, right? You're going to enter your data for your plants and your mixes and upload supporting documentation. And we'll talk about each of these steps over the next few minutes here. So let's talk about the training webinars to start with. We have an industry average, benchmarking training webinar. This one is required for anyone who wants to participate in benchmarking, right? To provide that data. You have to watch this webinar. It's about an hour and a half long. Pass the quiz. You'll be qualified then to, enter your data for benchmarking. If that's all you want to do is submit benchmarking data, you can ignore the whole rest of this training requirements. The second one is if you want to develop EPDs, right? If you're going to go to the next step of developing EPDs, we have 2 webinars. What are EPDs and how to use them? It's kind of similar to what you're seeing here, but some nuance and differences there. But we have a quiz there to make sure you actually learned what you saw, and then how to use the Emerald Ecolabel software itself. So those are required for the primary contact. So at least one person in each company has to do those 2 webinars. We recommend that all users do those 2 webinars, but we really leave it up to the primary contact to determine what the training requirements are for the users in that company, depending on their roles and what they're doing with the program. We have another webinar here on using the optimizer, which we'll talk a little bit about. And sorry for that. I have a mistake here. It's not required for anything. The optimizer is completely optional. So it's totally optional webinar, but that's available as well. So when you log in, the first thing you're going to do, you're going to go to this asphaltepd.org. You're going to hit the login button on the top right or the sign in button on the left. And it's going to bring you to the NAPA website using an SSL protocol. And you're going to use your NAPA username and credentials to log in. If you do not have a NAPA username and credentials, maybe you're not a NAPA member. That's okay. You can create that. You don't have to be a NAPA member to have credentials on our website. But we use this to understand your NAPA membership because that will affect pricing when you end up purchasing access to the tool. So you go ahead, you create your profile. The next thing you're going to do is let's take a look at what happens after you log in. There's a end user license agreement you have to acknowledge, just like anything in software spaces. But once you do that, set up your personal information, your name and contact info and all that sort of thing. You're going to see this kind of workflow of you're going to have organizations, plants, ingredients, and mixes. These are the 4 key areas of the software. And I mentioned earlier that data gathering spreadsheet. That spreadsheet actually follows this workflow, which I'll show in a few minutes. And so that's kind of the overall kind of site navigation is with these 4 key areas. So let's look at the organizations area for a second. So you can have multiple organizations. We know that there are a lot of companies out here that have multiple subsidiaries, right? So you can have those multiple organizations all under kind of one view or dashboard or account. Each organization can have multiple plants. That's very common. You know, you have a company that has 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 asphalt plants, and then another one that has another 3 or 4 or 5. You know, you can have that kind of set up. You can have multiple users. We don't have a limit on the number of users you can have in the software. And you can assign access and permissions to each user, either at the organizational level or at the plant level. So let's talk about what that means. If you're thinking about, you know, how am I going to configure my system? How am I going to set it up? Who's going to be accessing the system, right? So who's going to be on your EPD team? A lot of companies will, you know, they do all different sorts of things. Sometimes it's the environmental person who runs this. Sometimes it's the QC person. Sometimes it's someone in sales. Sometimes it's someone from the plants. But often you'll have someone else from one of those other departments or multiple folks also involved. So you can assign them permissions and get this granular kind of permissions authorizations here at either the organizational level, if you want them to have access to all the plants in that organization, or at the plant level, if maybe you only want them to have access to specific aspects of specific plants. So we give you a lot of kind of control over how you're going to manage and administer your account here. So the next thing we want to look at is the data gathering spreadsheet. As you know, before you start entering data into the tool, we wanted to have one place where you could just compile all of your data. You see the different worksheets or tabs at the bottom here. We have an introductory sheet. We have organizations. We have plant data, and actually that's what this one shows is the plant data. We have benchmarking data. We have specific information for portable plants if you operate portable plants. Ingredients, and then mixes, mix form A and mix form B, right? So it's really just one central place to put all of your data. So let's look at the plant data and talk through what some of those data requirements are. We're going to talk through what the plant data is, what the benchmarking data is, and we'll talk about some of the documentation requirements here in this section. So the basic requirements for the plant is we're looking for 12 consecutive months of data within the past 5 years. Most people use this on a calendar year basis. Some will use it for their company's fiscal year. Some will use it for other kind of time periods, right? Depending on what's appropriate for them, as long as it's 12 consecutive months. Most people use just the most recent 12 months. Like if I were doing it right now, I might use 2022 data, or I might wait until January or February and do my 2023 data. I'm going to look at how much fuel did I consume in the burner, in the hot oil heater. Maybe I have a generator or more than one generator. What kind of rolling stock equipment is at the plant as far as loaders and skid steers, that sort of thing. So you need all the records for how much fuel you've consumed for all that sort of equipment. How much electricity did you consume at this plant? How much water did you use? And how much mix did you sell? Not how much did you produce, but how much did you sell? And there's a difference here because most plants, almost every plant, has at least some amount of plant waste, right? Startup waste, shutdown waste, maybe switching mixes, maybe you have a bad batch or whatever. We don't want any of that energy and resources being allocated to any of that waste material. So we want it to be allocated only to the mixes that you sell, like the tonnage that you sell. So that's why we look at how much mix is sold. We keep data confidentiality as a really high priority here at Napa. And actually, I don't have, or no Napa staff member has access to your data inputs. The only people who actually have access to that are the software developers, software vendors. They operate under a non-disclosure agreement. And then we do work with some outside partners to help with developing benchmarks and averages. They also operate under a non-disclosure agreement. So, we're really careful about that. So common questions that we get about plant data. I get these from users kind of all the time. First one will be like, okay, we have a plant that's located at a site that also has a quarry and a central maintenance facility and a ready mix plant. and we all share the same natural gas meter, or we all share the same electricity meter. How do we allocate between our plant and the other operations? And ideally, you're going to be sub-metering your plants, natural gas, electricity, or other utilities. That doesn't always happen, right? So you have to come up with some way of understanding and estimating what that is. And you have to be able to document that. You have to be able to show your calculations, talk about your assumptions, what they are. If your data gets audited, you got to be able to defend the decisions you're making on this. What if inside the plant, maybe I'm sub-metering the natural gas meter to my plant, but then I don't sub-meter the hot oil heater? I'll say this isn't really required to do that. It's great if you do, but if you don't, you're just going to lump in your hot oil heater consumption with your burner fuel consumption, and that should be fine. It's not going to really affect any of the results. Sometimes, when you're entering your plant data into the software, it'll give you an error message, a warning. It'll say, hey, your data for your burner fuel or for your electricity is outside of the expected range. What do I do? The first thing I'll say is go take a look at your input data and make sure the units are correct, right? And sometimes people will say, yeah, it looks like the units are correct. Sometimes they'll say, oh, no, there's a mistake on the bill. That's really not uncommon for utility bills to have wrong units. Or sometimes you'll find out that the natural gas meter isn't reading correctly. And I've heard this from several producers who said, we found out we've been being overcharged by our natural gas supplier for the last, I don't know, 6, 12, 24 months. And they go back to their natural gas, utility, and they get a big rebate check, for all the overbilling and that sort of thing. Sometimes they figure out that they're actually really inefficient. And it makes them really look hard at what they're doing in their own operation. So there's a lot of different things that can happen in that space. Also on allocation, sometimes you'll share equipment between the plant and another operation on site, like a quarry or a ready mix plant, or equipment is going in and out of the plant and going to job sites and being swapped out. So you have to have a way to understand and estimate and document how you're making those estimates. A really common question is there's no water meter. Maybe a plant has its own well, but they don't have a meter. Maybe they don't really control it. Maybe there's an on-site quarry and the quarry comes by every day, a couple times a day with a water wagon and sprays down the roadways. You got to be able to estimate that. You have to know how much water do they use in a given pass, and how many passes do they do every time you operate. How many times do you operate per day? So you have to put all those calculations together and document them, and that's what you're going to upload into the system for your documentation. And it's really important that you do this, because in the event that you get audited, you're going to have to be able to back up your claims here. And so a lot of folks will do this by, I've seen it with internal memos, from one department to another, or a memo to yourself that you put in the system that kind of goes through all of your calculations. I've seen it with spreadsheets. I've seen utility bills, like there's a spreadsheet where you got a summary, and then you have each month's data, utility bill as a PDF, kind of all wrapped up into one. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So let's look at you've entered all your plant data, you got all that sorted out, and you say, okay, I want to do my additional benchmarking data, right? This is an additional data set. It's not required for EPDs, but if you want to participate in benchmarking, this is an additional data set that's required. So first of all, your benchmarking data has to match your 12-month data collection period. We're going to be looking for how much wrap did you consume? What's the average wrap content of the mixes you produced? And what's the total amount of wrap did you consume during those 12 months? For your aggregates, what are the 2 most used quarries at this plant? So for each of those 2 quarries, and maybe there's only one, if you're located inside a pit, for example, you might not use another aggregate supplier. How much did you use? How much aggregate, total quantity, and what are the transport distances and modes for those 2 getting that material to your plant, from the quarry to your asphalt plant? Same thing for your asphalt binder. Really, this for your most used binder supplier, what is the transport distance and mode? Information about your plant. Is it a batch plant? Is it a parallel flow drum plant? Is it a counterflow drum plant? What's the rated capacity? What's the diameter of the drum? how much production, what are you kind of operating in terms of how many total operating hours did you have in a given year? If you don't have that, maybe you can estimate, well, we typically operate, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 7 months out of the year, right? So you can give us that information to help, so we can help estimate the production intensity. And then how much polymer or rubber modified mix did you produce? So we want to understand, usually when you make those types of mixes, you're producing at a somewhat hotter temperature. We want to understand that and correct for it. And then we also want to understand the data that you're providing, is it good data in terms of, hey, we've submetered everything, or no, it's not submetered. We're estimating for this or that or the other thing. And how are you estimating that? So we want that information just as a data quality assessment for the benchmarking data. So what's this benchmarking data going to be used for? Obviously, developing the industry averages for FHWA's grant program, right? But the other thing is for the Energy Star program, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. The Energy Star, US EPA's Energy Star program, they have an energy performance indicator tool that they're developing for our industry, for the asphalt mix production industry. And once this is complete, this will be the basis for being able to get a plant certified by Energy Star as being an efficient plant in the US. These are 2022 certified plants, not asphalt plants. These are other industries that have EPI tools and can get certified. But hopefully by the end of 2024, we will be able to get asphalt plants that are efficient certified under this program. We'll talk about that later on. Now, once you've entered all your plant data, this is what it looks like when you're looking at your plants in the software. In the blue, it says test organization 2. You can toggle between your organizations by clicking on that button there. But you can see for the first plant, the first plant on here, they haven't entered their data, they haven't done anything. The second plant has entered the production data, but has not entered any benchmarking data. The third plant has entered some of their benchmarking data, but they haven't finished. And then the fourth plant has entered and submitted their benchmarking data, right? So once you submit your production data, you can create EPDs if you've purchased access, but you don't have to create EPDs to submit benchmarking data. So just to keep those two kind of separate. Let's talk about ingredients. So in this part of the tool, you're going to create a library of materials and suppliers. These will be stored at the organizational level, so shared across all of your asphalt plants. For things like aggregates, binders, binder additives that are blended at the field, mix additives. So let's talk about each of those really briefly. So for aggregates, as you're developing, as you're creating a new aggregate, right? You're going to create a supplier, right? This is the quarry it's coming from. You enter supplier information, and then you're going to give it a name for what's the aggregate name, and then you're going to select the aggregate type. Most folks are going to use natural stone, right? But you'll also see some other things in here. Some of the mineral fillers in particular, hydrated lime and crushed or milled limestone. It's a really important kind of differentiation between those two. Hydrated lime is hydrated and it's been calcinated, and there's a lot of emissions associated with it. Crushed or milled limestone is really just a milled limestone that's really ground into a fine powder and is more like an aggregate. The items you see here with a dagger, that indicates there's a data gap for that material. That means we don't have any upstream data associated with that material. If that's more than 1% in your mix by weight, you cannot develop an EPD. If you're using that and it's less than 1% in your mix by weight, then there'll be a data gap disclosure on the EPD, which we'll show in a little bit. Binders is going to be similar. You're going to have your binder supplier, you're going to name it something, and then you're going to pick your binder type. We really have 4 standard binder types: an unmodified binder, polyphosphoric acid or PPA modified binder, an SBS modified binder, and a GTR modified binder. The GTR is only for terminal blended GTR. If you're using a cutback, an emulsified asphalt, or a natural asphalt, then those are data gaps. I think the emulsions hopefully will be coming in relatively soon. No word yet on cutbacks or natural asphalts. The binders, the other thing is, if a lot of times you're going to have some additional additives, right, that are added at the terminal. So you're going to include this as part of your binder profile. And there's a whole host of additives. They don't all show up here. You can see that little scroll bar there. But this is going to be for your liquid anti-strips, your recycling agents, your warm mix additives, extenders, that sort of thing. For some data, we have very specific upstream data, like the Ingevity and Cargill products at the top here, where they've actually developed their own EPDs, and we've integrated those EPDs into our software, right? For most of these other additives, though, it's a data gap. We just don't have that data, so that will be disclosed as a data gap. And then you're also going to have, okay, so that was the binders. Now we have the field blended binder additives. These are the additives that you're blending at the plant. It's the same list of additive types, right? In the additive type here, same exact list as what you might blend at the terminal, but we give you the option to create that as a material that you're blending at the plant. And then the last piece on here is the mix additives. So these are things that are typically added dry, things like fibers. We've added hydrated lime here a second time as an anti-strip agent because some plants look at it differently. Some call it a mineral filler, some call it an anti-strip agent. So it really depends. We wanted to give people the option to kind of add it where it's more kind of natural for their mix design approach. But this is going to be, things like your fibers, your pigments, some of the warm mix additives that are not liquid additives, right? So that's going to be in here with your mix additives. So let's talk now about the mixes. You've created all your library of ingredients, right? You can always add to that and that sort of thing. Once you've done all this work, and you've created your first couple mixes, most users find it's about 10 to 15 minutes to create a new mix. The question that I often get is, boy, that seems like a lot of time for each mix. And then I ask the question, how many labor hours go into creating a new mix design for your plant? And I hear anywhere from 40 to 80 to 100 labor hours go into developing a mix design. So you could have give your mix design technician permissions and train them on how to enter this data. You're going to add 10 to 15 minutes to their workflow, right? And it's not going to be a huge impact, not necessarily. So what are the data requirements for the mix designs? We're going to look at, what kind of mix is this? Like whose agency specification is, what kind of mix is it, right? That you got to be able to identify this mix. And then how much of each of these materials is in your mix by weight of total mix? We'll talk about that in a second. How are each of these materials getting to your plant? And then we want to know what's your mix production temperature. That's really just for transparency and disclosure. We don't change any of your EPD results based on your mix production temperature, but we do disclose what that is. Are you calling it a hot mix, a warm mix, cold central plant produced mix? So on these materials, most people, when they do their mix designs, and most agencies require this, you're going to add up all your aggregates and RAP and RAS, all add up to 100%. And then the binder content is sort of added on top of that, right? So you end up with like 104%, right? Or 105, whatever that might be. Sometimes the binder content is the total binder content, and it doesn't show on the mix design the virgin binder content. So that's a really important piece. We need to know what's the virgin binder content, not the total binder content. And then you have additives. Additives might be dosed as a percentage of the virgin binder or the total binder or the total mix. And I've seen where additives aren't actually included in the mix design. I specifically have seen this with SMA mixes where they don't include the cellulose fibers in the mix design, even though they're putting it in the mix, right? It's not in the mix design. So you got to be careful here to make sure that you're accounting for everything that's going into the mix itself at the plant. Now in the EPD software, we need everything to add up to 100.00%. So we have to often adjust the mix design percentages to make everything hit 100.00%. So we have tools to help you do that. In the EPD software or in the data gathering spreadsheet, we have two mix forms, mix form A and mix form B. So if you've already done that math and you've got everything adding up to 100%, you'll use that mix form A. If you haven't done that, right? If your dry aggregates, your dry ingredients add up to 100%, you're going to use mix form B. You'll see you have your data inputs and then those two columns on the left, where we actually do some calculations to help kind of to pull all that down to add up to 100.00%. So we have that for you as a tool to help you do those calculations. Regardless, I want to make sure if you're like the environmental person or the salesperson, you don't really understand mix design, make sure you walk through this with your QC expert, because they're going to be able to understand what we're looking for here. The math isn't that hard, but it can be really, really confusing. It's simple math, but it's confusing conceptually sometimes. So please make sure you work with your QC expert on making sure you get these calculations correct. So once you've developed your mixes, you can view your EPD, you can publish your EPD, and then sometimes I mentioned earlier, if you have a data gap, if that data gap is more than 1% of your total mix, it won't even let you view the EPD because we've exceeded that threshold, right? Cannot develop an EPD if that data gap is more than 1% of the mix. So let's take a look at how to view the EPD and how to read the EPD. What's it all mean? Time check, and I think we're good. Yeah, we're good. Where can I find published EPDs? So the best place to find published EPDs is at asphaltepd.org/published, right? That is the real-time, kind of most up-to-date compendium of EPDs for asphalt mixtures. We have other program documents you can find at this website, asphaltpavement.org/EPD. That's where we have copies of the PCR, the underlying life cycle assessment, a whole bunch of other documents, the training software, all the training webinars. Everything else is at that page. So those two websites are really the two that you should be looking at. So you go and click into and open an EPD. You're going to find the company information, right? The cover page. Company information at the top, plant information, where's this plant located? Is it portable or is it stationary? That'll show up now. What is this product? What are you calling this mix? That's your own kind of mix name, is your company's mix name for this mix. Who's the agency, the specification entity? Which agency made the spec? What is the spec? Is it a mix type 3 or a level 4 mix or whatever, right? There's every DOT has their own naming convention for their mixes, but you're going to want to put the most appropriate one there. Some optional information like, what's the gradation? Is it a dense graded, porous, gap graded, Marshall versus super pave, minimum maximum aggregate size, type of binder, custom number from your contract, your contract number or something like that you can put in there. The red box there, that says, hey, this mix has a data gap. Go see the table 1 on the next page to understand what that data gap is. So this is for something where it's less than 1% of the total mix by weight. We're disclosing that data gap. And I will tell you, this is probably the only EPD program I'm aware of that actually does that disclosure front and center and very easy to see that. And then information about the EPD in that green box, which we'll look at in a few minutes. So again, this is a blow up of the product information. Now, this is really important when you think about comparability. Our EPD is comparable. And one of the key things is if they meet the same agency specification, they are probably comparable. That might not be the case, though, if you have data gaps and those data gaps are different, right? So if you have two mixes that meet the same agency spec, one of them has a data gap, one of them does not, then I would say they're not comparable. But if they both have the same exact data gap, and as an agency, you know what their mix designs are, they're both using the same maybe warm mix additive or something like that at the same dosage, then they're both missing the same thing. You're still comparable. Okay. The bottom part of this, information about the EPD, really, really interesting information here. One is, who's the program operator? This is Napa is the program operator, right? Verified, that information is there. The standards, what standards does this comply to, right? These ISO standards, the PCR for asphalt mixtures, right? Footnotes there that give links to those. When is this valid until? How long is this EPD valid? And one thing about our EPD program, and this is specified in the PCR, is all the EPDs expire when the PCR expires, which is March 31 of 2027. So if you create a new EPD on March 1st of 2027, that EPD will expire 1 month later, right? You have the declaration number. Each EPD has a unique declaration number and a unique version number, right? And a unique URL for each version of each EPD. That URL is only accessible publicly once you've published the EPD. After you've published it, before you publish it, that's not accessible by anyone unless you have permissions to view the data for that plant. The other thing that's on here, we indicate when the 12-month data gathering period began, right? So that's helpful to know how recent that data is. That's also helpful. There's a whole bunch of data reported in the EPD. This is just a couple of the tables. The one on the left here, table 4, is the life cycle impact indicators or global warming potential or GWP. But you see other things like ozone depletion, eutrophication, so that's what causes the dead zones, like in the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico and that sort of thing. Acidification potential has acid rain forming emissions. Photochemical ozone creation potential. These are the smog forming emissions. A whole bunch of information about energy and materials, recycled or secondary materials, that sort of thing, your freshwater consumption. So that's resource use indicators, and there's a whole bunch of additional data on the EPD. I do want to mention the declared unit, which is a really, really important aspect of the EPD. What are the units that we're reporting this in? So there's numbers here, all these numbers. What are the units? So this is the quantity of that, compound or that impact indicator per metric ton of asphalt mixture, and then in parentheses, per short ton of asphalt mixture. So these are international standards. They require the use of SI units because of their international standards. So that's why we have the primary unit in per metric ton of asphalt mix. But because we're in the US and we transact and sell asphalt mixes on the basis of short tons, we put that secondary number in there in parentheses as well. So easy, maybe a little bit confusing, but at least it's all there in the units that you want to see. So just drilling into this GWP number, you can see that I'm just zooming into this area here. We've got the A1 materials, A2 transportation, and A3 production, the total. And in this particular example, this mix's GWP would be 61.3 kilograms of CO2 per metric ton or 55.6 per short ton. So that's how you would read that number. Okay, so now you've done all this work to develop EPDs, you understand how to read them, you understand what you're looking at. What are the things that I can do to help my plant and my mixes reduce emissions if I'm going to start down this path of decarbonization? I see that I've got agencies that want to provide incentives for being a low carbon mix. How do I get there? How do I set up these goals? And I often can save money by doing this as well, by the way. So looking at in the EPD tool, we have a whole set of tools in the EPD software under this program called the Optimizer. The Optimizer lets you easily compare two of your own mixes to each other, like side by side, just really easily put that side by side and look at them. You're going to see more granular analysis. So not just that A1, A2, and A3, but each unit process or individual material, you're going to see all that data. It's also a sandbox. It lets you create variants of your plant to say, hey, what happens if I can reduce my burner fuel consumption by 10%, right? Let's create a variant that does that. What happens if I decrease my electricity consumption? I'm going to install some VFDs and that sort of thing. How does that affect my EPD results? So you can do that and just very quickly see how that affects things. And we have a couple of kind of pre-configured tools to look at both the economic and environmental impacts of switching your fuel type for your burner, as well as reducing aggregate moisture. Really cool tools integrated with all of your plant data and all that sort of thing that will help you understand the cost and emissions reduction potentials. This is just one of the outputs of the Optimizer. This is that side-by-side view of two different, in this case, two different scenarios for the plant. The one on, they're both using 20% RAP, but the one on the right is my conventional one that uses natural gas as a burner fuel. And the one on the left is a variant where I said, what if I was running diesel fuel here? And you can see in this lower portion, right, where it says production on both sides, left and right, it says diesel burner, natural gas burner. The diesel is much bigger, much taller than the natural gas. That affects the total EPD results. In this particular example, went from 38.3 kilograms to 46.8 kilograms, right? So really easy to just compare scenarios. You can look at two different mixes this way, two different plant variants, two different plants, all that sort of thing. Really, really cool stuff in the Optimizer. The other thing I would say is please participate in benchmarking, right? We said this before, I'll say it again. Please go, do this training webinar. If you're a mix producer, go in there, do your benchmarking. You've got another month or so to do that over the holidays. Things are quiet. Maybe you can start collecting some of this data. I do anticipate we're going to extend that deadline yet already, but I don't know how long it's going to be extended for, but please plan to do this. The other thing I want to mention is, back about almost 2 years ago, Napa announced the road forward. This is our vision for the industry, really member-driven, developing this vision for achieving net zero carbon emissions for the asphalt pavement industry by 2050. So really a kind of important initiative that impacts almost every single thing that Napa does today. So really important kind of aspect of what we're doing. Under the road forward, we've published already a number of documents. These are just a few of them. One of these on the left here, QIP 132, Production Strategies for Saving Money and Reducing Emissions. This was written by TJ Young. He's really one of the foremost experts on asphalt plant operations and efficiency and reducing costs and reducing emissions. This report should be read by every single mix producer, every single plant operator is mandatory reading. It's really well written. It's easy to follow, has some really easy to follow appendices with worksheets to help you do some calculations and understand what your opportunities are to save money and reduce emissions during plant operations. Fantastic report. Please go check that out. We have some information, this one in the middle, prioritizing RAP. This is sort of more of information for owners of the benefits from using RAP. And then the one we have on the right here, we have a number of case studies, operational tips. This particular one was written by our friends at Green Asphalt. They're located in New York City. These guys produce 100% RAP mix, hot mix. And they are very transparent about, they're like, hey, we have a really sustainable product. It's 100% RAP. It's a quality product, et cetera, et cetera. We did our EPDs and we were surprised our results weren't quite as low as we thought they would be. And so we've had to go back to looking at our plant operations to figure out how to be more efficient at the plant. So really good kind of example of how EPDs can help you improve your plant operations and analyze your plant operations. I just want to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the Road Forward sponsor partners. These are the companies that have contributed financially to this initiative and also with in-kind contributions of time and effort, information and that sort of thing. So just really briefly, just want to acknowledge them and thank them. And then I think the last thing that I'm going to talk about here before we go into the breakout session is the Apex program, the Energy Star program. So through Energy Star, we have an asphalt plant energy performance peer exchange group. We call this Apex. This is a way for you to, work with Energy Star, partner with them, learn best practices, how to manage energy at your asphalt plant, get an direct assistance from an experienced industrial energy advisor. There's all kinds of great tools in this program, and it's like a program that houses multiple programs. All this is free, right? Paid for by, your tax dollars, Uncle Sam and all that. You have the Apex Peer Exchange Group. You have the ability to become a partner with EPA's Energy Star program, right? And they want you to kind of showcase your partnership, right? Napa is a partner, all right? We have a number of companies that have joined as partners with Energy Star. If you do all the things they want you to do and you do a really good job of it, you can get recognized nationally as being a partner of the year. That's a kind of recognition they want to kind of showcase leaders in the industry. We have this program called the Challenge for Industry, which we do for an individual plant, right? So I've got 3 asphalt plants maybe in my, that my company owns. I'm going to set a baseline. I'm going to look at the energy. So all the same data you're doing for EPD, you're going to do that to set your Challenge for Industry baseline. You're going to say, I'm establishing a goal within 5 years. I want to reduce my energy intensity by at least 10%. How many BTUs per ton of mixed production? Reduce that by at least 10%. If you achieve that goal, they'll recognize you. So you'll get a letter, you can set up a press event, that sort of thing. to be recognized for achieving this challenge by reducing your plant's energy intensity by at least 10%. They have the plant certification program that's going to be coming out soon. Once we get that EPI, the Energy Performance Indicator tool, finalized, which is going to be based on your survey data, right? The benchmarking data. And then treasure hunts are basically the ability to, a structured program that lets you kind of go through your asphalt plant, sort of like an energy audit, but to find opportunities to reduce energy and to save money. That is the last thing that I have. I think well, maybe a few minutes over, but thank you so much for still being on this call and not falling asleep. And at this point, I think I'm going to unshare my screen and go into we can go to the panel.
Joseph, this is Mary. We've got some questions here. Just wanted to say first, that was a really great informative presentation. The first question for you is related to cold recycled asphalt mixes. So we know that those are known to be environmentally friendly. However, are they really considered low carbon mixes by the definitions that you shared earlier?
Good question. So usually when, well, a couple things. First of all, the EPD the PCR for asphalt mixtures includes cold central plant recycling. It's a plant produced mix, right? One of the challenges though is if you're using emulsions in your CCPR process, that's a data gap. So you won't be able to develop an EPD for a CCPR mix that uses emulsions. If you're doing foaming, then you could, right? So it depends on where you are there. The other thing is if you're using your conventional hot mix plant to produce a cold central plant mix, we don't quite yet have that ability to separate those out. We're going to be implementing that in 2024. So it would really only work today for kind of an independent, like a pug mill kind of plant that's running a foaming process for the asphalt binder, is what you could do an EPD for today. I expect by the end of next year, those limitations will, for the vast majority of cases, be lifted. But that's where we are today. So getting back to the actual question though, really the way those the low carbon material standards have been established through the Inflation Reduction Act, it's looking at comparable materials. And it's rare, I think, that you would put a CCPR mix up against a hot mix at the procurement stage, right? Typically, the agency is going to say, we're going to use CCPR. And that's going to be an agency decision. And so that's, so you wouldn't really be comparing those two to each other directly with the way the policies are currently structured. Now, I think there's space for that sort of policy development to occur where agencies can look at, oh, we've got data on our CCPR mixes, we've got data on our hot mixes through these EPDs that they're collecting, and make policy level decisions. Let those EPDs inform your policies, right? And that could inform maybe your pavement design philosophy, it could inform your maintenance program and that sort of thing. So that data can still be useful for those sorts of decisions, but you're not going to see it, I don't think, at least the way I understand it. And a lot of this will depend on the way Federal Highway structures their grant program, but I don't think you're going to see that at this point in time as hey, this CCPR mix is lower carbon than a hot mix. It's certainly possible, but I don't see a clear path for that happening under the current policies.
Great, thank you. The next question relates to greenhouse gas emissions and other sustainability impacts of warm mix over traditional hot mix. So has there been any data that quantifies the differences in greenhouse gas emissions for hot mix versus warm mix?
Yeah, we do that in a couple of ways. One is every year we publish the industry survey report for use of recycled materials and use of warm mix technologies. And about 3 years ago, we started including in that a calculation of the emissions reductions associated with use of recycled materials, RAP in particular, and associated with use of warm mix technologies. So that's a nationwide kind of roll up. The other thing we've done is we also have recently published overall industry-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventory that spans the years of 2009 through 2019. And in that report, we estimate what happens if we could really implement warm mix reduction, temperature reduction across the board. And that's part of a scenario where we're looking at potential emissions reductions industry-wide. Finally, we have a third publication that's due to be released probably in January of 2024. That's going to run scenarios for specific examples, like what happens if I run warm mix at reduced temperature? How much does that reduce the environmental impacts in a particular mix, for example? So we do have a number of resources that are out and that are also in the queue on that.
Fantastic. And the last question was, does NAPA use the FHWA LCA tool? So that's a little outside of this EPD, but I didn't know if you wanted to address this.
I'm familiar with it. We are certainly aware of it and familiar with it. I have a copy of it. I haven't actually used it for anything yet. But we have commissioned some research studies where we're asking the academics to use LCA PAVE to look at some other analyses. Those have not yet been published, so I'm not going to go into more details about them. So we're not directly using it, but we are commissioning research that's using it. Yeah.
Okay, and then there's one last question that came in, and I think this will be an easy one for you to handle. What is the reason for focusing strictly on cradle to gate as opposed to cradle to grave? And asphalt is one of the most recycled material in the world. Why wouldn't we produce EPDs based off a cradle to grave process?
Yeah, good question. So with the cradle to gate, you have to think about EPDs as being a data source for a much bigger kind of ability to look at what's going on with a product, with a material, that sort of thing. When you get beyond the gate of the plant, there's a lot of assumptions and scenarios you have to think about as far as, well, or specific case studies, for example. We've produced this mix and it's going to be put in this road at this pavement thickness and this pavement design, this traffic loading and this climate and this subgrade condition and all that sort of thing to really understand that performance over the long term. So we really think that what folks should be doing, whether you're agencies, and we've started to do this as well with some research NAPA has commissioned, but we haven't published yet, on looking at the full life cycle, where you're using the EPD as a data source for a whole life cycle kind of analysis or assessment. So that's really where things need to be moving long term. The EPD is really the initial piece of that, and it's a piece of the data. In the same way that, when you bid on a job, you're providing, a piece of the cost. The agency is looking at the total life cycle cost through like an LCCA. Same thing. The EPD is providing a piece of that information about the mix. And the agency can do a full LCA with LCA PAVE or other LCA software suites to really start looking at that full life cycle. Now, I will say that when you're using RAP in your mix, and I did not go into the details of this for this presentation, but when you're using RAP in your mix, if you're reducing your virgin binder content, that is going to significantly reduce the GWP reported in your mix. So we are seeing that kind of benefit from use of RAP on an individual mix perspective, where using the RAP or shingles, if you're going to reduce that virgin binder content, will have a big impact on your results.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. I think we'll kick it off to the expert panel discussion now.
Yeah, thanks. This is Charlie Godar from PAPA. Thanks everybody for being on the call today. I think this is an excellent opportunity for everybody to learn and to see where we are. We've asked a few people to be on, what we call subject matter experts. They've been engaged, they've been involved with producing EPDs. And our expert panel, it's Maggie, Noah, and Jason. What we'll do is, if you have questions for the panel, as we go on here, we've got about, well, a little bit over 35 minutes yet to go, with the webinar. So if you have any questions, including for Joseph also, he's sort of the subject matter expert on all this. Please, put them in chat,
Put them in the Q&A, please.
Q&A, or I'm sorry, Q&A, and we'll bring them up to the panel. So let's start off, Maggie, I know you're the environmental coordinator for IA Construction. You want to introduce yourself? Where does IA stand with developing EPDs? Do you have any advice for all the people that are on here as far as that haven't even started producing EPDs? So let's and then we'll go down to Noah, and then we'll go after Jason after that. So let's start off with Maggie.
Maggie, are you available? We'll go ahead to Noah.
Okay, Noah, let's Noah Schultes, let's go with Noah then, the Director of Sustainability for the Lindy Group. So Noah, do you want to introduce yourself and kind of tell us where Lindy is and with EPD development and any impediments you're running into and any.
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so Lindy Paving is the largest asphalt paving contractor and manufacturer in Western Pennsylvania. We're privately held. We're currently operating 12 plants. We've been talking about sustainability for several years. Dan Gano, I think, is on, but he's our Vice President of Operations. He actually served on NAPA's Climate Stewardship Task Force, which developed the road forward. So our senior leadership is bought into this. Why did we get into EPDs? I really feel it's an inevitability. We approach it like it's happening, and we'd be naive to think if we could somehow not do this in the future. Other construction materials, oil, gas industry, airlines, everybody is talking about decarbonization and trying to do business with lower emissions. So, Lindy, we feel it's better to face it head on and to be an early adopter. We needed to know how to incorporate EPDs into our business model. And so we figured it out. And that's really one of the things that makes us a leader in the industry. We take pride in trying to be the best at what we do. And knowing that reducing emissions in asphalt is the right thing to do, we want to help move that industry in that direction. So it's important for us to be part of the narrative and not to wait until the conversation's over and the rules are written, and then try to adapt. So we started producing EPDs this year, and we published 138, which I think is the second most any company has published. We're currently working on updating all of our plant data to be current to 2023, energy consumption. And our plan is in 2024, when PennDOT releases the mix designs, we'll be ready to produce an EPD for every mix that we make. So, the data collection process has been very enlightening for us. We've already identified cost-saving opportunities once we started looking at energy use intensity. We're excited to see where it takes us. So, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, and let me know if you have questions.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Let's go on to Jason Capel he's the Director of Technical Services at Peckham. So same, introduce yourself, your company, where you stand with EPD development, and any impediments or any information you want to share. So go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to participate. Jason Capel with Peckham. We are also a privately held company. We have operations in 5 states, New York and then New England. We run 18 hot mix facilities. We don't have as many published EPDs as NOAA, but we are poised to publish a similar number. I'm not gonna a lot of what NOAA has stated. I could restate, but in terms of time, I won't. We were also one of the inaugural members of the Road Forward, and we're very proud of that. And we've got a similar mindset relative to embracing what the future is going to be here with lower emissions and getting the industry where we need to be by 2050. With that said, one thing I will add, and maybe this will come out in the questions, is once you go through the data collection process, I encourage everybody to embrace it. There will be things that come up that you will not anticipate. Some of which Joseph mentioned, not having enough meters to really separate your energy use, particularly at a co-located facility where maybe you've got a concrete batch plant or you've got a quarry, shared garages, shared offices. How do you separate that information out? It really forces you to dig into your operation. With that said, similar to what Noah talked about, we are upgrading tanks right now at one of our facilities in Massachusetts, and based on what we've learned, we've upsized our insulation from what we normally would have done a few years ago to what we're putting on heated tanks as we speak. And so there's those types of upgrades that we've embraced as a company. Look forward to sharing our experience if there's any questions that come my way, and I can be of assistance.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that information. Is Maggie back up or not? Maggie was having microphone issues, so I guess Maggie's still not available.
Is Heather Warner available now?
Heather, are you on the call too?
I am on the call.
Heather Warner, do you want to give us a little overview too, since you and your company are intimately involved?
Yeah, I'm Heather Warner. I work with Alan Myers. I am the Performance and Sustainability Manager here at Alan Myers, and we've been working on our EPDs for a little over a year. We operate in 4 states, and we have EPDs created in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia now. We have 25 hot mix plants that we're creating EPDs for currently. And basically pretty much the same thing as Noah and Jason have said. It's been a journey. Every step of the way, we're learning something new with the plants, and in finding things where we're lacking, mainly maybe in meters and gathering data for all the information that's needed to create an EPD. But it has been eye-opening and showing us different ways that we can increase or reduce our carbon footprint across our operations.
So Heather, we got a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to start with this one. So maybe you can answer, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel. And maybe Maggie will be able to get back on too. When did you commence working on, researching EPDs, and what were some of your impediments when you're starting out? Because I'm sure we have some of our members from Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic that haven't started yet. Could you kind of how did you get selected to be the champion to do this, and how did you get rolling in Alan Myers to facilitate this?
So as upper management, upper management got bought into the sustainability program prior to bringing me in. And then I was kind of offered a position or voluntold that would be the my responsibilities. That was back in March of last year. And some of the impediments that I encountered initially, I had to do a lot of training on what is an EPD. But from there, the data gathering and where do I go? What information is viable information? What is the source of truth for the information that's required? And at our company, where I found the information, the best information to get was primarily from our accounting department. All of the information that I needed was found on many of the bills, and I kind of just went from there.
So Noah, same question for you then, you know, how did Lindy or how did you get going on this? I know you're kind of like maybe a little, maybe Dan was one of the key players here, but then you've taken over, but yeah, could you talk about, you know, how Lindy got going and, you know, did you have any impediments at all in the company or with staff?
Yeah, I mean, there was a definite learning curve that needed to take place. And so, you know, I wasn't here when they first started in April, but I did speak with, you know, plant managers and some of the folks and the engineers that made this happen. And, you know, one of the biggest challenges was, it's like Joseph said, it's kind of a paradigm shift where you start having to think about things a little different. And you know, having the tools that Napa's put together to utilize, you know, guide you through step by step what you need to do makes it pretty easy, but there's still a significant amount of data gathering you have to do. And you know, a lot of it is, you know, you're going to be able to find through your accounting departments and, you know, your invoicing and for utilities and whatnot. But you know, you have to start to think about how you're going to, you know, make that data more accessible as you go forward. And so I think those are some of the things that, you know, we work through. And then just learning the software itself. I mean, it's not hard, but it has its nuances and, you know, getting users set up and, you know, trained, you know, like it's just it's a process.
Okay, Jason, same question, with you, how did you get the assignment? Yeah. Did you voluntold like Heather did, or did you volunteer, or just somebody said, well, these are other duties assigned and, you know, just tell us a little bit, you know, maybe what your impediments were and how you overcame them. So go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, we have a technical services group which I have the pleasure to lead, and our ESG fell to our department. And so in generating the ESG, obviously there's a lot of overlap with sustainability, and so it was just a natural progression to assisting the company with the development of EPDs and our technical staff. Even though we're, you know, you could call us the environmental group, we've got people who had QC experience in our group, and so we service the company as in a wide array of operations, and this just naturally fell to our group. And like I said, it dovetails nicely with the development of our ESG. So that's how that came about. One thing in terms of challenges we had to overcome, and I'll just list a few. For example, we've got co-located hot mix facilities with quarries, with concrete batch plants. And unfortunately, in one situation, we have one meter that comes into the facility. And so it was a challenge to figure out how we were going to, you know, separate and make distinct allocations of energy throughout that facility. So one thing we did is we took a standalone hot mix facility that was of, you know, similar plant type, similar production, and we learned from that standalone facility their energy use, their fuel use, et cetera. And we applied that to the co-located facility. to help us have a rationale for how we were just, breaking up that commonly metered facility. So I bring that example up because in some ways you have to get creative, but also have a reason. What's the old saying? Have a reason for everything you do everything for a reason, and have a reason for everything you do. However that works, we applied that to this situation, and it worked out pretty well. We also have, I know there was a discussion of going to accounting. The way we're structured, the quarry, let's say, organizes the front end loaders and the skid steer and all of that. And they're not organized under the hot mix plant, even though they may be co-located. So when you ask, you look at fuel use that's assigned to the hot mix facility, it all is organized under the quarry. So again, we had to use that thought process as, okay, how much fuel is used for mobile equipment at a standalone facility, and then apply that to to the co-located facility. So we ran into those bumps in the road in the data collection. It's made us smarter. We have people looking at sub-metering at this point. But to get through the initial data collection, there are some vagaries that you come about when you start looking at particularly co-located facilities. And so if there's anybody has specific questions about that type of stuff, I'd be happy to answer in more detail. But those were some of the impediments we saw as we initially dove into this process.
All right, we've got some questions rolling in from the audience, so I'm going to ask the panel to answer them. If whoever wants to take the question from the panel, please do. So Mary, go ahead and ask the.
Yeah, so we've got 3 questions have come in so far. 2 of them relate to cost, and then one might best be answered by Joseph. So let's kick it off with the 2 questions related to cost. And I understand that, it may not be easy to separate the EPD costs, that there might be multiple people working on developing EPDs. But the question is, can you give a cost to develop an EPD per mix per plant? Just kind of an idea, maybe ballpark on that.
So I can provide the software license fee. We have it publicly posted, so there's nothing private about that. We charge a flat fee per plant, which gives the company unlimited use of the EPD software for that plant through March of 2027, when the PCR expires. So currently that price is $3,000 for NAPA members, and it's $6,000 for non-members. It's been a very substantial cost to develop this software and all that sort of thing. And that was largely unwritten by our NAPA member dues, so that's why it was such a stark contrast there between the member and non-member pricing. But that's just the software cost. As far as the time and effort, the hours spent within a company, I think I don't know if anyone else has actually calculated that within their company, but I'd be curious if anyone has an estimate of that. And what I will say though is what I've found, at least from the discussions I've had, is probably in the range of like 20 to 60 hours to set up a plant, especially for your early plants, maybe on the higher end of that. And then, like I said, for individual mixes, once you've done your first few, pretty small amount of time, 10 to 15 minutes. But any comments from the other folks? Are those reasonable estimates? For Jason or Heather?
Yeah, I'll just jump in quick. We did everything in house, so I don't have time cards from a consultant let's say. But on sites where we hit snags in terms of lack of metering or the way equipment is accounted for, I would say we were on that higher side of that 40 to 60 hours by the time everything got hammered out.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, once you're set up though, I mean, the costs are negligible. I mean, you're basically 10 minutes, spent, inputting the design with the ingredients you've already uploaded, and it applies to the plant data. And so, the costs are minimal going forward, but, like I'm about to, like I said, update my plant data. So, we can try to pay attention to how much time's being spent to do that, if that's helpful for you, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks. Heather, you had something out there?
Yeah, I was just going to agree, probably 40 to 60 hours worth of time for the initial setup, and then after the 10 to 15 minutes for each mix setup. I think that is has been my average also.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is no one's really been able to sit down and calculate the total cost of developing an EPD per mix per plant.
Well, I want to add, Mary, that, Jason made mention of this, but like I'm using the same data for other things. And so, our ISNET contractor rating is requiring us to, report greenhouse gas, calculation scope 1, scope 2. And so like I'm gathering the same information, for the Energy Star commitment, I'm submitting the same information. So like, like it needs to be done for multiple reasons. So again, it's hard to assign, all of that to the EPD, generation.
Right, understood. And so I think that probably, answers to some degree the next question, or maybe they are all connected, but the question is, how does EPD development, implementation and long-term use affect the cost of a ton of asphalt for the end user? So I'm guessing the question is more like, from your side, you're developing it and you're spending the labor hours to invest in the tool and actually creating the EPD. How does that affect the downstream final bid cost? Would be how I would read that question.
That's the way I'd read it too. Yeah. What's the impact? Is it gonna go up? Is it gonna stay the same? Is it gonna go down? It's something like that's gotta happen. So the panel, anybody from the panel want to address that?
I mean, this is Jason, unless, for our, I can only speak for Peckham, but, if there was a large capital investment in, changing burners or new tanks or whatever that had to be recouped, this initial phase of work that we've been doing over the last couple of years now has not trickled down. We have not taken, this is already staff that's in hand. This is, we've not hired anybody to do this. So, we fit this in our current workload. And so this has not had a reciprocal effect on pricing at this point. No, I can only speak for Peckham, but we have not seen a reciprocal or a transferred cost into a cost per ton.
Thank you, Jason. Anybody have anything else to add to that?
I mean, I definitely agree. I think our focus is still on, being as cost competitive and in the high quality asphalt production, that those are our drivers, for our decision making. I have heard rumors of the concrete industry, adding a premium for lower carbon materials, but, that hasn't been part of our conversation to date.
Thank you. All right. The last question that I've gotten in the Q&A is, at what point should you revise a published EPD? With small changes in components and conditions, will it change your GWP significantly?
Yeah, like I give you a for instance, like sooner or later here in Pennsylvania, we're gonna add recycling agents. They'll get approved. So it's kind of an example like that.
But I would think also, if you produce an EPD and you've changed your fuel usage, or, there's other things. Yeah.
Fuel type, yeah.
Yeah, this is Jason again. Exactly. We've got a facility that has, doesn't quite have enough natural gas pressure. So we have an optimizer on there, which puts a liquid fuel in under load. If ever we were to work with the the gas supplier to increase the pressure and eliminate that liquid fuel use under load, that would be a prime EPD to redo, because I think it would go down significantly without the liquid fuel add-on in that situation. So anything macro like that or major like that, it would in my mind precipitate a recalculation.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything else to add? Joseph, I don't know if you want to add anything here.
Yeah, what I'll say, certainly anytime you change your mix design, that should be a trigger for a new EPD or an update to your EPD. If you're getting a new mix design approved, for example, or a revision approved by the agency. But as far as plant operation goes, the ISO standard is, the other thing I'll say is sometimes you have a mix design approved with multiple aggregate suppliers or binder suppliers. You should really be differentiating those for specific suppliers. Sometimes that's harder to do than not, and that's a discussion, a really policy level discussion that hasn't really been fleshed out yet. As far as, what if it varies from 1 week to the next, and how does that work? But the ISO standard, it does say if you've made any significant changes to your operations, you should update your EPD, but it doesn't say much beyond significant, right? And so it's a little loose in terms of what the expectation or requirement is. And when we were revising our PCR the last time around a couple of years ago, some of the PCR committee members wanted to get a tighter constraint than the ISO 5-year allowance. But we ended up settling with, we're going to keep that, but what we're going to do is disclose what your data collection period was, so that the person looking at the EPD at least knows, is this data from like 4 years ago, or is this last year's data for the plant, right? So at least there's some information there from a transparency perspective as far as how recent that data is.
Perfect, thank you. Any other comments from the panel member? I do have another question here. Okay, so the question is, our industry has always prided itself and focused its main objectives around performance, essentially high-performing asphalt for roads. Are we shifting more to reporting and documenting data? And if so, what is the goal to that end, and how will it help for better performance? So I think, the question is related to, the EPDs are documenting greenhouse gas emissions, but it's not looking at performance, right? And that really kind of comes into that LCA tool, the whole life cycle assessment. But, how does this EPD help us get to, the overarching goal of better performance?
I'm happy to answer that, but if someone else wants to start first, I'll defer, but I'm seeing Noah's head shaking. So I think it's a really good question. We often get asked about performance, especially with respect to EPDs. I've heard comments like, am I gonna, end up with a crappy mix that's not gonna perform just to save a few kilograms of CO2 on the front end, right? I've heard that sort of comment before. And I think ultimately the way that we should be looking at this is the EPD and LCA information is providing another dimension in the way we look at and evaluate performance. When we think about performance, we think about engineering performance in terms of how long does this pavement last. We look at it from an economic perspective. How cost effective is this material or pavement design or maintenance practice over the life cycle of the pavement? And with EPDs and LCA, you now have the ability to look at it also from an environmental perspective. So I don't think anyone is advocating for only looking at environmental impacts, right? Or only looking at the upfront environmental impacts, the EPD data. I think what you see is this is providing another dimension in order to evaluate performance from the engineering perspective, the economic perspective, and the environmental perspective. And I'll tell you what's coming is the social perspective. I saw just in the last week, the first ever social product declaration has been published. Not for an asphalt mix, but for some other building material. This is where you're gonna look at the full kind of suite of the ESG, the triple bottom line of sustainability. Over the long term, you know, the customers, the agencies, the general public are concerned about all these things, not just the economic cost, but all of them. And long term, it's going to be a question of how do we look at all these holistically as a system. And then the last thing I'll say on this topic is I think EPDs are a really, really good match as agencies start moving towards balanced mix design. Where if you want to go implement balanced mix design, and if you're familiar with BMD, there's a few different types of doing BMD, types A's or pathway A, B, C, and D. Well, as you get into the C and D, where you're kind of unleashing the constraints of volumetric mix design requirements, that's really going to let industry innovate and use higher wrap contents, rejuvenators, other novel materials we haven't used in the past, other low carbon materials that can go into our mixes. And as long as we can be confident that those mixes are going to perform through the performance testing we specify in balanced mix design, we can start really looking at how do we reduce our carbon emissions from a materials perspective, while also ensuring performance or maybe even improving performance at the mix level. So I think all these are interrelated. And we have a real opportunity to look at multiple dimensions of performance. Sorry, it's a long kind of soapbox there, but it's a really good question, an important discussion to have.
Thank you, Joseph. I think that was a great answer. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that.
Noah, Jason, Heather?
Okay, I do have a question myself, and this kind of gets into the nitty gritties of developing an EPD, but you know, since all of you have had experience now developing an EPD, I guess the question is, what data did you have the hardest time getting, and you know, how did you resolve that?
This-
Maybe
Go ahead. Go ahead. Noah.
You know, I don't know if it was so much hard getting the data, but it's, you know, more the gray areas kind of that Jason was talking about, making determinations on how you're going to approach, you know, when you don't have submetering in place, you know, when it, and there isn't clear guidance on, you know, like looking at the BTU output of, you know, a burner, you know, like there isn't something that you can make an assumption based off of. You know, some of the separations that we had to do in those cases, you know, we had to talk to people and, you know, and document, like somebody else was mentioning, you know, the assumptions we were making. So, you know, when you come up against a gray area, I think that's a great time to reach out to, you know, those that have approached those types of problems before.
Yeah, for Peckham, it was the poor understanding of co-located facilities. The standalones were pretty straightforward. There were some ignorance on our part in the beginning. For example, something as easy as you know, you've got your total tonnage in a year. We did not take the step of understanding what may have been NEAT versus SBS versus, you know, PPA. So we had to go back to the drawing board on a couple of sites to understand the segregation of the different binder types, which, you know, once we learned that and we were smarter, then we were able to ask that question up front as we moved through the process. But there were some challenges in terms of accounting and lack of metering, and then was challenges in not understanding the full depth of what we needed. But once we learned that, it was you know, it was a learning process, and it got a little easier.
Thank you. Heather, did you have anything to say on that?
Nothing specifically to add. My issue also, I guess, was with the sub-metering, primarily with water usage for the different operations, um, and how that gets separated out so that it gets counted in the EPD for the production facility.
Okay,
Yeah, this will be the final question, and we'll turn it back over to Bruce Barkovich from New York. You know, did you make any changes to your plant or your overall operations based on producing EPDs? And, you know, the other thing is EPA is coming out with some money for grants to update your facilities, and the IRS is coming out from tax credits. So, did you take it, maybe you don't know, but are you looking to take advantage of that opportunity also? So I'll open it up to the three panelists, and then we'll give us a quick and dirty answer, and then we'll wind it up with Bruce.
I'll go first again, but we're absolutely, taking into consideration plan upgrades, that will help us deliver lower carbon asphalt in the future. I mean, it's like I said, I think it's inevitable. We're trying to, figure this out as a leader in the industry. And, we are looking at opportunities. And so if there are incentives being offered to, produce lower carbon materials. Again, I think it's important for the industry to be at the table for those conversations, and to tap into those resources, if the funding breaks loose for those types of things. So.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I mentioned it already, in a new tank situation, we're upgrading it, we're going for thicker insulation. We're making some of those nuts and bolts changes during our CapEx expenditure on items. We've started looking at hybrid, and we're not just looking, we've got hybrid loaders in our fleet now. So we do have an eye towards helping lower that total carbon footprint, not only in plant, but also in mobile equipment.
great.
Anything else? That was tremendous. Thank you to our three panelists, and Bruce, I'll let you do the wrap.
Thank you, Charlie, Mary, Joseph, wonderful presentation. And if you don't feel it, Joseph is the expert. He been around him many times, and I'm impressed every time I'm with him on how he's leading our industry in this direction. And thank you to our panelists. Maggie, we're sorry we couldn't get you on, because I'm sure you could share similar stories to what we had from Jason, Heather, and Noah. I do want to recognize our SAPAs who are involved in this program, our state asphalt pavement associations. You can see the final slide. Snap a quick picture of that. So if you need the questions, reach out to these people. They are working internally in their individual states on the next stages of this process. I just want to make some personal observations. With everything, I thought the question around performance was very meaningful, and that we're right now, this is our measuring stick and our measuring tool we have today. But 2-3 years from now, that stick will be a little different. And how will we be measuring things and introducing the concepts that we're talking about: balanced mix design, performance testing, the tools we have. As agency folk, I do ask you to look at your specs. We did have a brainstorming effort to talk about specifications and how do they limit the opportunity to become more sustainable with our efforts. And I think everybody needs to look internally, whether it's industry, agency, to decide how are we going to move ahead together. So lastly, again, I want to thank our panelists, our experts here, and please reach out, take advantage of the knowledge available, and we'd love to partner with the opportunity to move ahead here. This event will be recorded. It has been recorded, so your SAPAs will get a link to that, a recording, and if you want to share that, I think someone can take some valuable information. So again, thank you all for your attendance, really tremendous. And I know this is one of many regional, local efforts that'll be done in this arena. So again, thank you and look forward to seeing everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. Great job.
Thank you.